October 8, 1871. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the city of Chicago, the fastest-growing city in the history of the United States, was gone. Not damaged, not wounded, gone. Welcome back to The Burning Oath, the channel that never flinches from the fire, the history, or the truth. Tonight, we are going back to the night that rewrote American history. The night a city of wood and ambition and dreams met a fire that had no mercy and no end. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. You think you know this story? You don't, because this isn't just a history lesson. This is about the people who burned, the firefighters who fought the impossible, the city that should have died and refused to. Stay with us, because this story still has heat in it. To understand why Chicago burned the way it did, you have to understand what Chicago was in 1871. It was a miracle. A city that had grown from a frontier trading post to a metropolis of 300,000 people in less than 40 years. It was the railroad hub of America, the meatpacking capital, the grain exchange, the gateway between the industrial East and the frontier West. And almost all of it, the buildings, the sidewalks, the bridges, the warehouses, was built from wood. Chicago in 1871 had approximately 60,000 buildings. Of those, roughly 40,000 were made entirely of wood. Even the buildings that looked like stone were often just wood with a thin brick facing, a facade of permanence over a skeleton of kindling. The sidewalks were wood, the bridges across the Chicago River, wood, the miles of wooden roads laid over the swampy ground, wood, the grain elevators, the lumber yards, the warehouses, all of it, wood. The city was, in the most literal sense possible, a tinderbox. The summer of 1871 had been brutal. Chicago received dramatically less rainfall than normal. The city and everything in it was bone dry by October. The wooden buildings had been baking in drought conditions for months. In the 2 weeks before the Great Fire, Chicago had suffered no fewer than 20 smaller fires, the dry conditions turning every spark into a threat. The fire department was exhausted, equipment was damaged, and the city kept building, kept growing, kept ignoring the warnings. Chicago's fire department in 1871 was not small for its era. It had 185 firefighters, 17 horse-drawn steam-powered fire engines, and a network of fire alarm telegraph boxes across the city. But it was protecting a city of 300,000 people spread across 36 square miles, mostly made of wood, during the driest autumn in memory. The math was never in their favor. Their chief, Robert A. Williams, had been warning city leaders for years about the fire hazard. Nobody listened. Politicians worried about slowing down growth. Builders worried about costs, and the firefighters kept responding to call after call, wearing themselves and their equipment thin. Before we watch the city burn, we need to know who lived in it. Chicago in 1871 was a city of immigrants, German, Irish, Scandinavian, Czech, who had come to build new lives in a new world. They ran the stockyards and the bakeries and the saloons and the churches. They had names: Patrick O'Leary, a laborer on the west side, and his wife Catherine, who kept a small dairy in their barn. The Mussers, a German family with 4 children. Matthias Schaefer, a watchman in the courthouse tower who would play a fateful role in what was about to happen. These were the people of Chicago, and their city was about to be taken from them. The night of October 7th, the Saturday before the Great Fire, Chicago's firefighters had already fought a massive blaze on the city's west side. It burned for hours and consumed 4 city blocks. The men were exhausted, some equipment was damaged, the horses were worn. They went to their bunks that Saturday night bone-tired. They did not know they would not sleep again for 2 days. 9 p.m., October 8th, 1871. DeKoven Street, West Side. It begins, as great disasters so often do, with something small. A barn, a Sunday night, a fire that starts so modestly that the first people to see it thought it could be put out with a bucket. The O'Leary barn on DeKoven Street caught fire at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening of October 8, 1871. The exact cause has never been definitively proven. The famous story that Catherine O'Leary's cow kicked over a lamp was likely invented by a Chicago Tribune reporter and has been largely discredited. What is not disputed, a fire started in that barn, and within minutes, it was beyond any bucket brigade on earth to stop.
Come on, ring!
The alarm box failure that changed everything.
Whoa!
Chicago had a fire alarm telegraph system, a network of boxes across the city that, when pulled, would send a signal to the central alarm office and dispatch the nearest companies. But on the night of October 8th, a watchman named Bruno Gall, whose drugstore was near the fire, tried to pull the nearest alarm box, and it malfunctioned. He sent a messenger instead. Precious minutes were lost. Meanwhile, courthouse watchman Matthias Schaefer saw the fire from his tower and sent the alarm, but he misjudged the location and sent engines to the wrong part of the city. The companies that could have stopped the fire in its infancy arrived late. Some arrived at the wrong address entirely. In the history of disasters, a few lost minutes have never mattered more. The fire department arrives. Too little, too late. When the fire companies finally reached DeKoven Street, the O'Leary barn was fully involved, and the fire had already jumped to neighboring structures. The dry conditions, the wooden buildings packed tightly together, and a powerful southwest wind combined to create something the firefighters had never faced before. The fire was not spreading, it was exploding, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, jumping the width of entire streets, moving faster than men on foot could run. Chapo, the wind, the fire's partner in destruction. Southwest wind, 30 miles per hour. Gusts, the fire's accelerant. The fire had a partner that night, a powerful, relentless southwest wind that had been blowing for days. It was this wind that transformed a barn fire into an apocalypse. The wind lifted burning embers and carried them hundreds of yards ahead of the main fire front, igniting new fires before the old ones had even reached the buildings between. The fire wasn't marching through the city. It was teleporting, appearing everywhere at once, defying every tactic the fire department had. The city wakes up to fire. By 11 o'clock that Sunday night, Chicago's residents were waking to the sight of a glowing orange sky. Church bells were ringing across the city, the universal alarm. People ran into the streets in their nightclothes, looking southwest, and saw what no city dweller ever expects to see, the horizon on fire. Some grabbed what they could carry. Some ran for the lake. Some, incredibly, went back to bed, convinced the fire department would handle it. They were the ones who lost everything. The Chicago River, the last line of defense. It failed. For a brief, desperate time, some city officials and fire commanders believed the Chicago River might stop the fire's advance. Water barriers had stopped urban fires before. The river might be the salvation of the city's commercial core. They were wrong. Shortly after midnight, burning debris from the south side crossed the river on the wind and landed on the Parmalee omnibus stables on the north side. The stables caught immediately. The fire had jumped the river. There was no longer any natural barrier between the fire and the rest of Chicago. Chicago's commercial heart, consumed in hours. Chicago's business district, its banks, its hotels, its newspaper offices, its finest stores, was built with the confidence of a booming city. The buildings were taller and some were faced with stone. The owners believed they were fireproof. The fire disagreed. One by one, the grand buildings of the Chicago Loop ignited. The Tremont House Hotel, the Sherman House, the Tribune Building, the courthouse itself, the massive stone courthouse, burned from the inside out as its wooden interior acted like a furnace within stone walls. The firefighters' last stand. The firefighters of Chicago fought through the night with everything they had. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted before the fire even began. Their hoses ran dry as the water mains failed under the heat. Their horses collapsed from exhaustion and terror. Their steam engines broke down one by one. And still they fought. not because they believed they could win, but because that is what firefighters do. They advance toward the fire until there is no more fire to advance toward, or no more of them left standing. 100,000 people flee their homes in a single night. What followed was one of the largest civilian evacuations in American history to that point. 100,000 people, a third of Chicago's population, were fleeing simultaneously, on foot, in wagons, pushing carts loaded with whatever they could carry. The streets became rivers of humanity. Families were separated in the crush. Children were lost. The bridges over the river became choke points. Thousands pressing across while embers fell like rain from the burning sky above. People threw their possessions into the river, into the lake, into wells. Some buried their valuables in parks intending to come back. Some never could. Individual stories. The human face of the fire. In the history books, the Great Chicago Fire is statistics and economics. In reality, it was 10,000 individual disasters happening simultaneously. A German family that escaped with nothing but the clothes they slept in. A widow who had spent 30 years building a boarding house on the north side, watching it become ash. A young couple married just 2 weeks before the fire, their new home gone before they had lived in it a month. These were not statistics. These were people, and every one of them had to find a way to wake up the next morning and decide what came next. The Chicago waterworks burned. The city lost its water supply. In what would prove to be one of the most catastrophic single moments of the entire disaster, the fire reached the Chicago waterworks on the north side. The waterworks, a magnificent Gothic structure of limestone, housed the pump house that supplied water to the entire city. Its wooden roof caught fire. The pumping machinery stopped, and in a single terrible hour, the firefighters across Chicago watched their hose streams dwindle to trickles, and then to nothing. Without water, the fire department of Chicago had become spectators. Midnight to dawn. The longest night in Chicago's history. From midnight onward, the fire was completely beyond human control. The entire fire department of Chicago, exhausted, waterless, outmatched, could do nothing but try to stay ahead of the blaze and get people out of its path. By 1 a.m., the business district was gone. By 2 a.m., the north side was burning. By 3 a.m., the fire had consumed more than 400 acres, 60 city blocks in 3.5 hours. People who fled to the lake stood in the shallows with water up to their waists and watched their city burn. Some stood there until morning, because there was nowhere left to go. October 9, 1871. Rain arrives at 2:30 a.m. At approximately 2:30 in the morning of October 9th, rain began to fall over Chicago. Not a storm, just rain. Steady, quiet, ordinary rain. It was the only thing in the world that could stop what was happening. And it did, slowly. Over the next several hours, the rain worked where 185 firefighters and 17 steam engines could not. By the morning of October 10th, the Great Chicago Fire was out. The morning of October 10th, 1871. The Reckoning. When the sun rose on October 10th, 1871, it rose over a ruin. Approximately 17,450 buildings had been destroyed. 73,450 people were homeless. An estimated 300 people had died, though the true number was certainly higher, as many poor and immigrant residents were never officially counted. The fire had burned approximately 2,000 acres, nearly 3.5 square miles, right through the heart of one of the most important cities in America. What remained of Chicago was ash and a people, and a choice about what came next. The firefighters in the aftermath. The firefighters of Chicago had fought for nearly 30 hours without relief. When the fire finally died, they did not rest. They began the grim work of searching the ruins for survivors, for bodies, for anything they could do. Many of them had lost their own homes in the fire while they were fighting it. They came off the line to find their own families among the homeless, their own streets turned to ash. This is what it means to wear the badge. You lose everything, and you keep working. Help begins arriving within 24 hours from across America. Something extraordinary happened in the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire. Within 24 hours, aid began arriving from across America. Food, clothing, lumber, money. Cities sent fire engines. Cincinnati, St. Louis, Milwaukee, even cities that were rivals of Chicago commercially. The response was a portrait of what America could be when it chose to be. And Chicago, rather than mourning what it had lost, almost immediately began to rebuild. The investigation. Answers that never fully came. The city of Chicago wanted answers. Who had caused this? Who was responsible for the ruin of their city and the deaths of their neighbors? A board of police and fire commissioners' investigation was convened. The O'Learys were hauled before it. Catherine O'Leary was grilled for hours. She denied everything. Her cow, her barn, her lamp, she denied all of it. The commission ultimately concluded that the fire started in or near the O'Leary barn, but could not definitively establish the cause. It didn't matter. The newspapers had already decided. The cow did not do it. Scapegoating the O'Learys. The story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern was invented by a Chicago Tribune reporter named Michael Ahern, who later admitted he fabricated it to make a better story. It spread across America anyway. It became the story. The O'Leary family was destroyed by it. Catherine O'Leary became a recluse, never recovering from the infamy. She was Irish and Catholic and poor, which made her a convenient target for a city looking for someone to blame. In 1997, 126 years after the fire, the Chicago City Council officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow. The apology came a century too late. The real cause: systemic failure, not a cow. The Great Chicago Fire was not caused by a cow. It was caused by decades of reckless growth, by builders who prioritized speed over safety, by politicians who ignored fire codes to keep the building boom going, by a fire department that was underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed before a single spark was struck. It was caused by a city that had bet everything on wooden buildings and dry summers and hoped for the best. The fire was the bill coming due. Chicago shall rise again. The city's answer to catastrophe. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary chapters in American urban history. Chicago did not mourn itself into paralysis. Within days, while the ruins were still smoldering, plans were being drawn up. Lots were being bought and sold. Builders were arriving from across the country. Within a year, over 10,000 new buildings had been constructed. Within 2 years, the physical evidence of the fire was almost completely gone from the downtown core. Chicago had not just rebuilt, it had reimagined itself. The Great Fire gave birth to the modern American city. The fire that destroyed Chicago also liberated it, because rebuilding on such a massive scale all at once, with no existing structures to work around, allowed Chicago's architects to experiment in ways that had never been possible before. The result was the birth of the skyscraper. The Chicago School of Architecture, with William LeBaron Jenney, Louis Sullivan, and Daniel Burnham, pioneered the steel frame construction that would define every major American city for the next century. The fire burned the city of wood. What rose from the ash was the city of steel and stone that we recognize today. Fire codes born from the ash of Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire did something else. It forced America to confront the way it built its cities. New fire codes were enacted almost immediately, not just in Chicago, but across the country, as city after city looked at their own wooden buildings with fresh horror. Fireproof construction materials were mandated in commercial districts. Fire departments were expanded and better funded. The fire alarm telegraph system was redesigned.
The amendment is adopted.
Every building you have ever stood in safely, every exit sign, every fire door, every sprinkler system, traces a line back to the lessons paid for in ash and lives in Chicago in 1871. The survivors. Where they went. Of the 100,000 people left homeless by the fire, most stayed, most rebuilt. Some were broken by the loss and left Chicago forever. Some became wealthy in the rebuilding boom. The O'Learys stayed on DeKoven Street. Patrick O'Leary, a day laborer, and Catherine, forever infamous, lived out their lives there quietly, the weight of a city's undeserved blame on their shoulders until the end. By 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition. 22 years after the Great Fire, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, the 1893 World's Fair, a city of magnificent white buildings constructed on the lakefront, electricity lighting the grounds, 65 nations represented, 27 million visitors. The city that had burned to the ground in a single night had become the marvel of the world, not in spite of the fire, in some ways because of it. The Great Chicago Fire, the disaster that made modern America safer. The Great Chicago Fire is not just Chicago's story, it is America's story. It is the story of what happens when ambition races ahead of wisdom, when growth is prized over safety, when the warnings are ignored because addressing them costs money. It is a story that has been told again and again in American history. In the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, in the Station Nightclub Fire, in every disaster that could have been prevented and wasn't. The lessons of Chicago are still being paid for somewhere in America right now. The firefighter's lesson. Resource versus risk. For firefighters, the Great Chicago Fire carries a lesson that is as relevant today as it was in 1871. You cannot fight a 21st century fire with 19th century resources, or ignore hazards until they become disasters. The Chicago firefighters were not failures. They were heroes placed in an impossible situation created by the decisions of people who would never face the consequences. The 185 men who fought the Great Chicago Fire deserve to be remembered not as the men who lost, but as the men who held the line until there was no line left to hold. The Chicago Fire Academy stands on the site of the O'Leary Barn. Today, on the exact site of the O'Leary Barn on DeKoven Street, the spot where the Great Fire began, stands the Chicago Fire Academy, the training facility for Chicago's firefighters. It is the most deliberate, most meaningful, most perfectly chosen location in the history of American fire service. Because the place that gave birth to America's greatest urban fire disaster now trains the people who prevent the next one. In memory, the loss of the Great Chicago Fire, October 8th to 10th, 1871. The official death toll of the Great Chicago Fire is listed at approximately 300, but historians believe the real number is higher, lost in the chaos, the ruins, the displacement. People who simply disappeared and were never found. To every person who died in the Great Chicago Fire, in the flames, in the panic, in the cold and exposure that followed, you are remembered. Your city remembered you in the most powerful way it could. It refused to die with you. The Great Chicago Fire burned for approximately 27 hours. It consumed 3.5 square miles of one of America's greatest cities. It left 100,000 people homeless and killed hundreds. And from its ash rose a city more magnificent than the one it replaced, a city of steel and stone and architectural genius, a city whose lessons in fire safety echo through every building code in every American city to this day. The firefighters of 1871 Chicago could not save the city, but they saved something more important, enough of its people to rebuild it. And they did so with everything they had, for 27 hours, without water, without relief, without any real hope of winning. That is not failure, that is the definition of the oath. This has been the burning oath, where the fire never goes out, and the stories that matter are never forgotten. If this documentary lit a fire in you, share it. If you learned something tonight, tell someone. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to The Burning Oath, because history is not over, the fire is not out, and we will be here every week with the stories that prove it. The oath isn't just taken once, it's kept every single day.